Hello everybody and welcome to a new edition of Jan's opening clinic. First of all, let's get the sound issues and stuff out of the way. Can you guys see me and hear me? That's what I really want to know. If you can do so, type in the chat. I really won't follow the chat all that much because I have my hands full answering the questions that were posted in the news article about this very exciting event. So I will try to go through them one by one. The format is we publish a news article where you guys can ask me your opening questions if you're a premium member, and I will try to answer them to the best of my knowledge. Normally I do get tired at some point, like 1 hour within the show, and then my answers become shorter and more condescending. But don't feel bad about this. It's not you, it's me. So let's try to get started. This normally involves a lot of switching of windows and clicking, so I'll screw it up a couple of times, and then you can yell out in the what's called the chat thingy. And remind me, we can't see the board, we can't see you, we can't see anything. And hopefully I will see it. I'm already not making sense and we're just getting started. So let me try to do this. 1 second, let me arrange all my windows here. And let's go. Question number 1 by Mr. Let's Beast. Let's Beast is saying, "Hi Jan, I usually answer 1 c4 with c6 and try to transpose the game into a Slav or a Caro-Kann. Why not? Some of my white opponents hold back d4 quite some time on these lines, and I was wondering what are the pros and cons of this. Black can take advantage of a delayed d4 in the opening. Can black take advantage? Or if it is a good thing to do for white, for example." Then he gives a line, so we will try to switch to that line. Which can only take a couple hours. Here we go. c4, c6, knight f3, d5, e3, knight to f6, knight to c3, e6, aiming for a semi-Slav after d4. And here, Let's Beast gives the move bishop e2, which I must admit I've never seen. More common way to hold back d4 is queen c2 here, which is quite theoretical these days. You have a choice between bishop d6 and knight bd7, both playable, but there's some subtleties that one should know here. So bishop e2, yeah, I'm not very familiar with. The main move I would assume here is knight bd7, when I doubt that white has anything better than going d4 sooner or later. But I quite like the move Let's Beast gave with d takes c4 here immediately. Bishop takes c4, b5, bishop e2. And now anything really. Knight bd7 looks quite typical, aiming to transpose once again into a sideline of the Maron because the bishop is committed to e2. Normally if white had already gone d4, we'd go to d3. So here d4 is supposed to be harmless, and after, let's say, castles a6, I think black is fine. You just want to go bishop b7 and c5, and I can't really see any pluses to white not having played d4. He doesn't have anything better than going d4 at some point. If you try a setup with d3, no, that just looks stupid. Black goes bishop b7 and c5. So to answer your question, this bishop e2, I don't see any pluses to holding back d4. Queen c2 is a slightly different story. Here you have to know some stuff. I think I like the move bishop d6 here, aiming at a quick e5, and after d4, knight bd7, we transpose to normal territory once again. That was Mr. Let's Beast. Let's get back to the next question. Excellent English, Jan. Where could that be? And who could it be by? Mr. Audremer is asking, "Moin Jan, thanks for another opening clinic. You're very welcome. We haven't done one for a while. What would you recommend against the Pirc? e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. I saw that many authors are recommending the Austrian attack with 4f4, but I never felt very comfortable in this line. In training I played a bit the 150 attack. Is that what's called? With a white setup like in the Yugoslav attack of the dragon. Bishop e3, f3, queen d2, long castle and kingside attack with good results. So is there any drawback to of this variation in the Pircs, or why is for f4 more popular? I don't know. I think it's a matter of taste, really. I think the line you're giving is perfectly playable, and so is the Austrian attack. So it really comes down to personal preference. I'm not sure. I'm not much of an e4 player, so I don't get this often. I think the Austrian attack, if you study it, there's some hopes for a small plus, but it's a playable opening for both sides. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the move bishop e3, or of course the move knight f3, or the move g3, or the move bishop g5. It's all a matter of taste, since the Pirc doesn't really challenge the center all that early. A lot of lines are playable here. And yeah, I have no problem with the, whatever it's called, the 150 attack, queen d2, f3, h4, if that works for you. So I think it really comes down to personal preference. I prefer positions where you don't have castles on opposite sides, so I'm more inclined to play something with knight f3, bishop e2 here, but it really is a matter of taste. So by all means, keep going for the 150, that's an established main line. Nothing wrong with it. Do we have any more questions? I'm already 2 in, so I feel like this should be about it for today. But my best guess is it's not. Daya. Hello Jan. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Hedgehog system was extremely popular. Example line, which I'm going to get to in a minute. In these days, the Hedgehog is hardly to see. Is it just a temporary fashion, or are there now convincing methods to fight against the Hedgehog? What setup do you recommend for white? I don't think your original statement is true. I think the Hedgehog is still a very popular line, and it's being played at top level quite a bit. So I do not agree that it went out of fashion. Let's see, where do I have it? Move order like this. A lot of people, if we're going with this move order, slightly prefer the double Fianchetto in this situation. So that's, well, it has similar ideas to the Hedgehog, but that could be a reason why we see a little less e6. But as I said, I think we see plenty of this stuff still. I don't know what I recommend here. I normally play d4. Rook e1 is another move, which is very playable. I normally go for this stuff, takes, queen takes, d6. And here, yeah, white has a bit of a choice. Rook d1 is a move. Bishop g5 is the main line, and I think a reason the popularity could have dropped a bit here is that after the main move a6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes, and queen to f4, black is not really in trouble, but he has to defend a slightly passive position in many lines. Let's say something like this: rook d1, bishop e7, knight to e4, takes, queen takes. And while nothing exciting is happening, black faces a bit of a patient defense here if he wants to play this. So that's probably what I would do with white, but I wouldn't claim it leads to anything exciting really. It's just, yeah, the best I know. I used to play a bit of this line with rook fd1 and queen d2 here, but if black knows what he's doing, there's not much there. So yeah, I disagree. I think the Hedgehog is still popular. I think we've seen Adams play it this very year, Ivanchuk play it this very year. So not with you on that one. And yeah, it's playable opening. Let's get to the next question. Mr. Strandtomt. Is that the name? Strandtomt? Hi Jan, what do you recommend for black against the following variation in the two knights? e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d4, e takes d4, and e5. Thank you for great content on Chess24. Thank you. What do I recommend against that stuff? I always have to get back to the original position from the previous question, so this will always take a minute. Bishop c4, knight f6. Now, in my opinion, the problem with knight f6 is the move knight g5, which leads to very sharp play, but depending on my mood, I normally don't trust it or don't want to enter it, so I catch myself playing a lot of bishop c5 instead. the line you're giving, d4, e takes d, e5, is playable, and sometimes we see some strong players playing it. I think Nakamura won a game with it recently, but I don't think it's supposed to be very dangerous. I've always had a bit of a weakness for the move knight g4 here, just because it looks goofy and I think it's playable. When after queen e2, queen e7, bishop f4, f6, black is fine. So the critical test after knight g4 is castles. And here I'm not 100% sure how black is doing, but last time I checked, black was okay here. So if you want something slightly offbeat, then have a look at knight g4. But the most clinical way to play is just to play d5. This is the standard counter-strike in the center. Bishop b5, knight e4, knight takes d4. And here bishop d7 is playable, but I quite like this line that Onyshuk played with bishop to c5, which seems to be a pretty clean equalizer. Knight c6 doesn't work because of bishop f2. Check it out if you don't believe me. It does not. So white has to more or less go bishop e3. And after castles, knight takes c6, b takes c, bishop c5, knight c5, bishop c6, rook b8. All of this is forced. This is the game, Nakamura, Onyshuk. If you check this a little bit, it turns out that black is just equal here. White is not in time to play b3 because then queen g5 followed by queen takes e5 is problems. So white has to go for something dullish like castles, rook takes b2, queen takes d5, queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes c2. And Nakamura managed to win this position, but it still is very, very equal. Knight a3. I think this is the game. Not very relevant theoretically, but here after rook ac1, just knight e6, and black should really not lose this. So I believe this is the cleanest equalizer, but there is many other choices, and I kind of like knight g4 if you want to mix it up a little bit. What else do we have? By the way, I'm keeping half an eye on the chat. Don't pose any questions there anymore. I have my hands full with like 50 questions in the news article, so I can't really react to questions posed in the chat. But of course, feel free to chat along. Just don't expect me to get into the questions you post there. I will stick to the news article. Speaking of sticking to the news article, let's bring it up. Who's next? SK3. What's SK3 up to? SK3 is saying, hello Jan, when we listen to live commentary, GM always says someone got equal position. But how to know when is equal? How to evaluate it? Or it just the GM sense? Thanks. Not technically an opening question, but I don't know. I try to explain why I think it's equal when I do the live commentary. But of course, that's one of the biggest skills or one of the core skills in chess. You have to be able to evaluate a position. If you're calculating any line, for example, you always have to evaluate at the end, is this position equal, better for me, worse for me? Do I want to play it? Do I want to avoid it? So yeah, it probably is the GM sense and the experience or the knowledge, especially in the opening, that the line is supposed to be equal. But it would be going too far to try to explain chess here, why a position is equal or why not. It always depends on the position, and you always give an estimation. Can be equal, can be a dead draw, can be complicated, can be unclear. I don't know. I don't hear that many GMs saying this position is equal, let's move on. But they tend to be right. They're grandmasters. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah, it's a very broad topic. You have to be able to evaluate a position. Another kind of general question by Mr. Anand N. Hi Jan, how about some thoughts on the Sicilian Dragon / Najdorf for the thrill seekers? Another question I don't get. Do you want my thoughts on the Dragon and on the Najdorf? I can give you those. The Najdorf is one of the main openings out there. It's perfectly sound and leads to very interesting play. So by all means, play the Najdorf. It's a good opening. It's not a coincidence. It's so popular with world champions and at the highest level, and always will be. It's just a good opening. Dragon is also sound, but it's a little more tricky. You have to know a lot of stuff just to survive, and there's some lines where I'm not 100% comfortable with black, but it's also an opening that is very, very playable, and if you want to specialize in that, go ahead, but if you're looking for a friend for life, I would probably stick with the Najdorf rather than the dragon. I hope I got the question. Maybe he meant the Dragendorf, some weird mix of the dragon Najdorf, but that only works in very particular lines. So I'm not sure what to say about that. But yeah, the Najdorf is a good opening. Dragon is a little more shady, but also playable. What's next? Robin Nielsen 94. Speaking of the dragon, he's asking me some dragon questions. Hey Jan, I'm a dragon player as black and was wondering what you think about the position on the diagram. Is there a line that really puts black under pressure here? Thank you for your answer and your great videos and commentary on great events. Thank you, sir. Let's see what we got. This position that he's posted is one of the very main lines of the dragon. I'll try to bring it up in a second. It's not one I've ever studied in great detail. Let's try to get there. Here, yeah, I would probably do something more goofy. Knight takes d4 and bishop e6. So one of these Chinese dragons with bishop d7, rook b8. One of these sidelines. I've always been a little scared of this main line. But as I said, I've never studied it in big detail. King b1, knight c4 here is supposed to be trouble because of takes and g4. So they play some weird waiting moves like rook e8 and a6. Rook e8 is a move Robin Nielsen gave. Once again, I'm not a big expert. I do know a little bit. They go h4, and in order to avoid getting mated, you have to go h5 here. Now bishop h6 is supposed to lead to a tiny positional advantage, but nothing too bad. So the funny lines are g4, h takes g, and h5, which I believe are very dangerous. I'm not going to cover all the sidelines here. The main line is something like this. It's exactly this, actually. And I do believe it leads to a slightly unpleasant position for black. Not a lost position, but slightly unpleasant. So I wouldn't be that tempted to go for it. But as I said, I'm not a big dragon specialist, and I'm sure one can spend many, many hours of happy analyzing here, looking at moves like g3 or bishop h8 or... well, I'm sure there's lots of alternatives. Last time I checked, the main line was this stuff, and I didn't like it for black. Not saying it's losing. Even the final position I gave is by no means losing. It's just, yes, slightly unpleasant. But that's one reason for me to stay away from this stuff. Let's switch windows once again. All this window switching. And try to bring up the next question. Ginger Tail is asking. What's a ginger tail, by the way? Like a fox. Hi Jan, I quite like the black repertoire c4, c5, knight f3, c5 of Niklas Huschenbeet. So do I. In another show you mentioned that's quite coherent, but you would eventually choose one or two different lines as black, which are more to your taste. Please tell us which are these. Thanks so much. Can't even remember what I said. And I must admit I also can't remember all the details of Niklas's repertoire. I know it's based on this stuff. And here g6. Yeah, I think what I was talking about is in this position. For example, Niklas gives e6, which is a perfectly playable move, but I favor d6, castles, bishop f5, which really, no chess reasons, it's just something I'm more comfortable with. And yeah, I can't remember what else he gives in these. In the main line here. This stuff, I think, is one of the main lines. I think Niklas gives e6 here, which, once again, is a perfectly playable move. But I would probably go for knight takes c3, followed by knight to d5, and go for this stuff, which, once again, is a matter of taste. Both lines are very playable, and I think Niklas did a good job on that repertoire. And I can recommend it to anybody who hasn't seen it yet. Let's switch to the correct resolution, screen, whatever. But you get the idea. Overall, yeah, nothing wrong with the repertoire at all. I think he did a good job, and it's very much to my liking. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Niklas Huschenbeet, whatever it's called. Knight f3, c5, a repertoire for black, something like that. Or a repertoire against knight f3 and c4. Let's see if we got more questions. Tony Rowe. Hi Jan, thanks for doing another opening clinic. I noticed that Garry tried out d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4 in his fateful game against Babula in the Euro Cup a few days ago. I noticed that as well. I'm wondering if there's anything troublesome about this move order if black is willing to play the Ragozin Nimzo. I looked at a few ideas. Knight f3, knight f6 is just a simple transposition to the Ragozin, and e3, knight f6 is very likely to transpose to common Zamish or Rubinstein Nimzos. There are some independent options white can try, cd5, ed5, bishop f4, and so on, but the one that worries me is cd, ed, a3, bishop c3, bc, knight f6, e3, castles, bishop d3, c5, which reaches the famous Botvinnik Kappa Avro game. Is this position playable for black, or should I search for something else? Avoid this move order altogether? Looks to me like Tony Rowe pretty much answered his own question. He's mainly teaching us about stuff here. And yeah, so I agree. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. It's not the most common of move orders. It's sometimes used if a very strong player is trying to throw a slightly weaker player out of book, like we've seen in this Anish Giri game, where it backfired. Another idea is after knight f3, you could contemplate d takes c4, which is interesting. And yeah, I also agree with your fear after cd, ed, a3, or a3 immediately tends to transpose, takes. Black doesn't really have anything better than going for stuff like this. And this position, I'm not sure how bad it is. We were all raised on this famous, whatever it was, Botvinnik Capablanca game. It's probably not that terrible. Nowadays they play b6, then bishop a6, and try to exchange those guys off early. But I do agree, I would slightly prefer white here. The thing is, it's an unbalanced position with, yeah, especially for the stronger player, there's very good chances of ending up with some bad bishop against a good knight scenario. So it does give black winning chances. And you can choose it according to the occasion, but for everyday use, once again, it's not a coincidence. You don't see this every game. Well, you see a lot of Nimzo-Indians, which are a little more flexible than having your pawn on d5 already. So yeah, I think you answered your own question and also hit on the critical line, so I don't have that much to add. Let's see what else we got. Spills with many Z's. Hey Jan, my question is about the position after d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, 3 bishop f4. How would you continue with black? Ideally, I'm looking for a dynamic system where I can try to unbalance things and possibly play for a win. Thanks. P.S. What do you think of the FIDE anthem? The players always look awkward during the closing ceremonies of major events when it's being played. I haven't noticed that. I barely recall that, yeah, at the closing of the Rapid and Blitz, they played a bunch of anthems, but I didn't notice any particular awkwardness in any players. Mainly people are just annoyed. Normally they have to get up and stand there because any anthem is played and it tends to come surprising. But I haven't noticed that phenomenon. Then again, a room of 500 chess players standing still, one or two are supposed to look a little awkward, I would assume. Anyway, let's get to your question. As usual, you want a playable dynamic system that gives good winning chances without taking any risks. That's at least my interpretation. Now for me, if I know my opponent's going to play one of these bishop f4 systems, we have a question about it later, I probably wouldn't go e6, but I would go d5 or c5 or g6. Because after e6, both bishop f4 and bishop g5 are very solid. Still, not the end of the world, of course. I don't know, I would probably go for some like Hedgehogian, if that's a word, it's probably not, type of setup with c5, b6. Normally it plays something like this. Don't know about the move order. Let's say bishop d3 first. Bishop e7, h3, castle, c3. And you get a position like this, where, well, it's not hard to play with black. You go knight bd7, a6, queen c7, rook e8, rook c8 probably, bishop f8, and then take it from there. Sometimes you want to go b5, sometimes you want to go e5, sometimes you want to do something else. It's very hard for white to come up with a plan as well. So that's probably what I would do if I stumbled upon that position, which normally I don't. But there's also nothing wrong with playing it very classically. Let's say c5, d5, knight to c6, bishop to d6, and short castles. It's not the scariest of systems, but white has done nothing wrong, so of course it's very playable for white. Hope that helps. Let's see if there is anything else. I'm not sure why I'm making up weird accents, but I shall keep doing that. Venka. Do you pronounce it like that? Venka? Not sure. Hi Jan, I'm a huge fan of your shows and commentary. Thank you so much. So here is my question. I play d4 with white and I have a personal nemesis called the King's Indian. So I decided to learn the bayonet attack, and I have a problem when my opponent doesn't go 6 e5 and goes knight bd7 or knight a6 instead. Can you tell me what should I play against those? Thanks in advance. In advance. I believe your problem is not where you think it is. Let me. What's going on? Music starts to play. Is it in the studio? No, I think it's coming from outside. Do they already start these Christmas markets? Is it that time of the year? At least it's cold and rainy and dark already, so might very well be. Anyway, to answer your question, you said if they don't go e5 here, but go knight a6 or knight b7. But both of these moves are played with the intention to play e5 next move. And actually, it's much more common to start with e5 and after castles to go knight a6 or knight bd7. So you should castle against either because you're going to get the same position anyway. And here, yeah, knight a6 is a full-fledged main line where you need a repertoire. You need to study it, just like knight c6. Many playable moves, rook e1 is one of them, bishop e3 is the one I normally play. Nowadays I tend to go c6, d5, knight g4, and you get some very complicated position like this, which, yeah, white has decent chances for an advantage, but it's very playable for black. But there are alternatives, as I mentioned. You can go rook e1 here, or move earlier. And yeah, knight bd7 is a little less popular, slightly less flexible, it's blocking this bishop, so people don't do it that much anymore nowadays. And once again, you have a choice, all the moves are good here. Queen c2, rook e1, bishop e3. I tend to go bishop e3 anyway, just to keep it consistent. Normally I play c6. If they go knight g4, as always, bishop g5. So normally they go c6 here. And the main line is d5, c5, knight to e1. Now if knight to e8, people have been going g4, just fighting against f5. But knight d3 also gives white a bit of an edge, f5, f4. So yeah, that's what I would do, but it's both main lines, so you need to study them, just like the bayonet attack that you studied. And as I mentioned, yeah, the move order doesn't really matter, but knight a6 and knight bd7 are both aimed at playing e5, so it's more common for people to go e5 first, and then after castles play either knight a6 or knight bd7. Wow, it's really horrible music. What is going on? There's a construction site nearby. Are they having a concert or something? I do not know. I'll just keep soldiering on. Shacho says he's in Hamburg over the weekend. If there's any chess on Saturday, I do not know. I don't leave my house on weekends, so I wouldn't know. I don't think so. I haven't heard of anything. But you can check out the Hamburg Chess Club if there's anything going on there. I don't know. Nicolas Kung, number 5. What is he saying? He's saying, hey Jan, in the English, after c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, d4, cd4, knight d4, e6, knight c3, black can play the quite rare move 5d5. I can't really find any continuation for white that leads to an advantage. What would you recommend? Thanks in advance. Yeah, that's a decent move. Nothing wrong with it, so I'm not too surprised. Let's bring it up. C4, C5, Knight F3. Not sure about the move order. Let's use this one. Takes and D5. Yeah, as you mentioned, the main moves here are Knight C6 and Bishop to B4. But there's nothing wrong with D5, as far as I know. What I would probably do is what Wang Hao did against me, which is just takes and Bishop D2. It's a different move order, but leads to the same position, where I think White has chances for a tiny edge because of this typical G3, Bishop G2. The Bishop can put some pressure on the Queen side. However, even here, if Black knows what he's doing, it shouldn't be too much. He can go Knight F6 or do what I played, Bishop C5, Knight B3, Bishop B6. So it's nothing special, and yeah, it's a playable line for Black. Another move I've seen them do is play Bishop F4 here. Some cruel intentions like Knight B5. After Knight BD7, there was some recent game. I think Nisipianu played this. Queen A4, stopping E5 and going for some trickery. But here after Bishop C5, Knight to B3 castles. I think he took on C5. I was wondering if White can go CD5 here instead. When, yeah, nothing too dramatic is happening. But I always have a liking for positions where my opponent has an isolated pawn. So one could look into this. Not sure, however, because the queen is a little misplaced. So yeah, long story short, nothing wrong at all with the move D5, unfortunately, as far as I know. I would take it and go Bishop D2 and hope for a small edge there. Let's move on to the next question. Well, there's some horrible Christmas music playing outside, as if I wasn't cranky enough already. They're trying to torture me with this stuff. Oops, wrong screen. There you can see the Chess24 live chess viewer, as we call it, which I used to use for doing these shows. Oh, and speaking of cranky, there's Pramod NVS with a long question where, as usual, first of all, he wants to discuss TV shows. Hi Jan, what's your opinion on The Flash and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? I've seen an episode or two of The Flash, but it looked a bit like this Smallville stuff. I think it's more for teenagers. So yeah, I wasn't into it. And Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., from all I hear, is just a train wreck. I've also seen one or two, but yeah, didn't do it for me at all. The only superhero show that I've seen and liked recently was Daredevil. There's like one season on Netflix. I thought Daredevil was excellent. They have a very good Kingpin, very good antagonist. So yeah, I don't like either The Flash or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And Pramod also thinks that Jane the Virgin has been the best series for the past 1 year or so. I don't know, that's a romantic comedy drama based on a telenovela. I'm not planning to watch that, but thanks for the tip. Coming to chess, he likes my recent series on the Catalan. Thank you so much. And the Berlin Wall, where's the question? The Berlin Wall and its explanations of themes along with Paco is pretty insightful. Thank you so much again. My question is, what's your suggestion to play against Queen's Gambit accepted for an opening advantage? When Black plays 3c5 to give White an IQP. Learn some fancy shortcuts, our friend Pramod. Isolated Queen's pawn. Is there any way to get an opening advantage here? I am not 100% sure what you mean. That's the phenomenon we seem to get quite often with Pramod's questions. I'm assuming you mean after e3 c5. Because there's also e4 here, which is the main move, but that normally doesn't lead to an isolated queen's pawn. There's also knight f3. After all these moves, Black can play c5, but I'm gonna guess you mean this. And yeah, this is a matter of taste. I believe in this very pure version of the IQP, White is supposed to be a little better, and Black players normally don't go here very much after standard development, whatever. This is supposed to be a comfortable version for white. You get your pieces out and you can put some pressure on the black position, but it depends if you like playing with an isolated queen's pawn. If not, I would go 3e4 where you don't get these positions. And, sorry, yeah, here there's some sidelines like queen to c7. There's some tricks normally they're hoping for. What are they hoping for? Bishop b3, bishop g4. And black players feel very clever about themselves when they can get that in. I think queen c7 doesn't make that much sense. You can just go queen d3, for example. And the queen on c7 is a little misplaced. So yeah, there's chances for an opening advantage in these lines, if that's what you meant. Moving on. Matutev is saying, "Hi Jan, could you show a way to fight against the Semi-Slav defense without being complex positions? Is that possible after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e3, knight bd7? What are the main plans with white and what black plans we should avoid?" Thanks a lot. Matutev is a strong player. I'm surprised he's asking for the main plans with white and black because, as you know, this is a very complex position and every move can change plans a lot. So, not sure, but to answer the question, if you don't want complex positions, which I think you mentioned, the most solid setup white has is to play queen c2, black plays bishop d6 normally, and now to play with b3. Here you don't need to know all that much. You need to know after castles, you're supposed to start with bishop e2, because after bishop b2, e5 is good for black, or interesting at least. So you go bishop e2, black normally plays b6, whatever, castles, bishop b7, bishop b2, and this leads to a pretty quiet, playable position. Main plans are to maneuver better than your opponent. Black will probably try to get in c5 at some point, while white can contemplate getting in e4 in many positions. So yeah, this is a playable line. It's not supposed to be terribly dangerous for black, but certainly playable. There's lots of subtleties according to where you want to put your rooks. c1, d1, e1, d1, e1, c1, not move them at all. So yeah, this I think is a quiet position one can get, and here you can play without knowing a lot of theory. Just go rook d1, rook c1, bishop f1, see what happens, e4 at the opportune moment. That I think is the approach people take that want to avoid complex positions. I hope that helped. Who knows? You never know. Next question. Sunder is saying, "Hi Jan, could you show the best way to get a playable position after one knight a3 and knight h3? Thanks in advance." I'm guessing that's an attempt at humor. I'm not sure. I believe Sunder is a very talented Dutch junior player. And I'm sure they taught him in the Stappen method that knights should be developed to the center because a knight on the rim is dim. So that's all you need to know after knight a3 or knight h3. Play a move that does something in the center like e5, d5, knight f6 or whatever. And you're fine. Thanks a lot for this contribution, Sunder. What else we got? Shibayen. "Hey Jan, what do you think of the Grunfeld reversed arising after long line? Can white obtain an advantage after rook b8 or bishop e6? Yeah, probably. Let's bring up our little software. I don't know, the Grunfeld reversed, I forgot which move order you gave, but people don't go there with black. This is supposed to be too risky. In this position, normally they play e6, or if they take here, they would probably take on c4 and not go e5. This is supposed to be very, very dangerous because very often a tempo doesn't really matter in openings with colors reversed, but in the Grunfeld with this center so vulnerable, it does matter. However, yeah, you gave bishop e6, I think that was supposed to be much better after bishop g5, and you gave the move rook b8, which I wasn't aware of, but I've seen this as a computer recommendation, hoping for some compensation if white grabs the pawn prematurely here. Bishop b4 check, and it seems like black is okay. But it's a bit hard to believe too. Rook b8, I think bishop g5, I've done a little clicking here, should favor white. Rook takes b2, castles, and yeah, Pirc gives something like queen a5, queen d3. That's very hard to believe black can play like that. So, long story short, don't do it, it's too risky. Play something more solid. Or not necessarily more solid, but it's not a coincidence that in this position e6 or cd and dc are more popular. Or, well, you have many other options, obviously, e6, g6, whatever, or go d5 a little earlier. So, I don't like it, but this rook b8, thanks for pointing that out. I wasn't aware of that move, and that might be worth pursuing further. To me, it looks like after bishop g5, white is better there as well. Moving on, Summerbird. Summerbird, hi Jan, in the so-called O'Kelly variation, e4, c5, knight f3, a6. Most of the white players answer with c3, which leads to a good and solid play for white and is probably a bit underestimated. Hang on, if most of the white players do it, why is it underestimated? Seems like most people are aware of that. Best is perhaps 3c4, but rarely played. I'm usually on the black side, so I have some experience. The question therefore is, what do you think is the best answer for black after 3c3? Two possibilities, d5 or e6. Well aware. Many thanks for your effort. Not planning to give that much effort here, frankly, but it's a bit of the usual. I play a strange sideline and they play a good move against it. Now what should I do? When the answer is normally, don't play the strange sideline. So, e4, c5, knight f3, a6. Yeah, the main point of this is that d4 is no good, but most people know that. So, as you mentioned yourself, c4 and c3 are both a little unpleasant. I would add g3 to that list, also not a bad move. So yeah, you ask after c3, what would I do? Well, I would avoid this position, but if I had to choose, I'll probably go d5 here. The problem I have with e6 is here you need to cover too wide a range of positions as black. You need to be ready for e5, you need to be ready to play this position, and yeah, I don't like it. So I would probably go d5 and hope that the move I spent on a6, which is kind of useless here, is not too bad. You tend to get a position like this, and yeah, cd if white is ambitious. I don't know, how do they play? Probably knight c6, knight c3, queen d6. And you could argue that a6 makes some sense, controlling the b5 square. Still believe white has pretty decent chances for an opening advantage here, with a move like bishop g5, or maybe even g3, planning bishop f4. But that's the lesser evil in my opinion, and the one I would choose. However, as usual, in the opening, it makes sense to fight for the center, so e6, d6, knight c6 tend to be better moves than a6, that's my opinion. But as a surprise weapon, or once in a while, or if you want to specialize in that, by all means, go ahead. Howard, number, too long a number. 1001001. Is that some binary code reference I don't get? Asks a question which I think has been asked in many of these clinics already. My question, is the anti-Moscow gambit playable for white, or do you think that I should just stick with the Maron? I would prefer to be aggressive with the bishop g5 lines, but white appears to be falling on his face a lot in these. What is your opinion? Are you considering future video series including the triangle, Maron and the bishop g5 lines? No, I'm not. I was into that stuff like 10 years ago, but me and I think most people have grown a little tired of the Semi-Slav anti-Moscow, that whole complex. So yeah, I normally stick to this Maron territory or even go e3 here or whatnot. Because yeah, I'm not that up to date here. I think black is doing alright. Normally if white players go here, or often nowadays they just take on f6 and play the quieter position. However, of course it's playable here. If you're well prepared with white, this position is very dangerous for both sides. So normally, whoever has a better feel for these things and whoever is better prepared will come out on top here. I've played it like a couple times when I had a particular idea. I managed to win a game or two out of the opening here, but I wouldn't do it for everyday use. Bishop e2, bishop b7. The main lines used to be h4 and castles. As far as I know, black is okay in both of these. Nowadays you see some experiments with an early queen c2. I think Tomaszewski won a nice game here very recently after knight h5 or something, bishop e5. He won a good game, but I'm not that up to date. I think knight h5 is probably not the move to play. Knight bd7 or some stuff. So, of course it's playable, but yeah, this field has been a little exhausted like 10 years ago when everybody was heavily into it, and nowadays most white players stick to the Maron or bishop g5, h6, bishop f6, because they're a bit out of ideas here. Not saying there can't be any fresh ideas, I'm sure there can be, but that is the status quo. And yeah, I wouldn't go there unless I had a very specific idea, which I don't at the moment. Such is life. The next question is by Mr. Lunamil. Where's Lunamil from? Lunamil? Portugal. Greetings to Portugal. Hi Jan, in the variation of on the video series on the Catalan, in the line d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, castles, dc, queen c2, a6, a4, bishop d7, queen c4, bishop c6. You said that it's a mistake to go knight bd2 because of bishop b5, but I faced 11 queen b3. Any recommendation after that? Because b7 is hanging. Regards from Portugal. Yeah, I stand by what I said. And after... Where do we have that stuff? In case you haven't seen it already, I of course highly recommend my video series on how to deal with the Catalan, where I talk about this line in some detail. However, I didn't spend much time on the move knight bd2 because it's not a good move. It's actually a blunder. Not as bad as knight c3, which runs into b5, but knight bd2 also spoils white's chances for an opening advantage because of this cute little trick. As was mentioned by Lunamil, yeah, queen b3 is the best move for white, but it's no good either. Bishop takes e2, queen takes b7, I guess, is what he wants. Then bishop f1, queen a8. Black has a very pleasant choice here. The simplest way to play is bishop takes g2. Bishop e2 is also a small black advantage. But this looks reasonably straightforward, and black gets a slightly better endgame, which is a good outcome of the opening with black. So yeah, and if rook e1 instead, you just take on f3, and black is also a bit better. So I hope that answers the question. I may have one more line. After bishop f3, you should play the slightly clumsy rook a7, hanging on to the b7 pawn, because now bishop takes b7 doesn't work due to c6, and this bishop is being picked up. So yeah, knight b2 is a mistake, bishop b5, and black is fine. Bishop f4 and bishop g5 are the moves to play here. What else do we have? Do we have anything else? Philip Rieke. Hi Jan, what would you recommend against such aggressive Dutch variations like d4, f5, g4 or d4, f5, h3? What is a good continuation against the Gambit after d4, f5, e4? He's trying to provoke me. I've gone on record many times giving my opinion that the Dutch is not a very good opening, but yeah, the moves Philip Rieke is giving would not be the ones I would be concerned about. Breaking most of the laws of chess. 1 second. So d4, f5. g4. I don't know. Nowadays you don't have to accept all the crazy gambits that are being thrown at you. So it's a very solid approach. And I think the main line here is to play d5. Gf, just bishop f5, then get your pieces out. And if g5, that's what they normally do. You go c5, followed by knight c6, e6 and whatnot. And black should be alright. I mean, as alright as you can be with the pawn on f5. h3, yeah. What can I say? h3 has its pluses because of the d5. You don't have to go g4, but you could switch to normal play with actually quite a pleasant position. So black should probably wait with d5 here, go knight f6, and if g4, once again play d5. If g5, now you can jump to the center of the board, and once again you're doing alright. Yeah, d4, f5, e4, looks like a terrible move. You give up a central pawn and you justify this weird 1 f5. Not into details here. If they go f3, I think you're supposed to go d5 and you're better, or whatever, it's playable. After bishop g5, well, many moves look logical. g6, c6. I think the main line is knight to c6. Now, yeah, white takes on f6 is just worse because he gave up the bishop, so they tend to go here and now here or here. Black puts his knight on f7 in some strange type of position where I think black is supposed to be alright. Let's say takes, bishop e7. And you have the two bishops, and it's a very good outcome of the opening, considering you started with 1 f5. I would worry more about knight c3 or bishop g5 or all the g3 main lines. But that's just me. Anyway, thanks for the questions. I hope that helped. Pawn Grabber is asking, hi Jan, huge kudos to you and your shows, and of course Chess24 in general. Thank you, Pawn Grabber. You are very inspiring for someone like me, who is desperately trying to play boring but successful chess for all of his life. Thinly veiled insult, but I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you, Pawn Grabber. My today's question is, it happens more and more that my opponents pretend to play the Semi-Slav, but after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight 3, e6, e3, they transpose into the Stonewall with f5. How should I react? I think my normal setup against the Dutch with g3 and bishop g2 doesn't make sense. Very true. And the alternative with bishop d3, knight g2 and f3 is no longer possible either. If I deviate earlier by playing 3 knight c3, I don't like the gambit lines with d takes c4. Do you find any solution for my problem? Many thanks in advance and keep it up. Yeah, I have the same problem, so I'm familiar with this situation. Well, what I do is not to play e3 here, but to play queen c2, avoiding all the dangerous triangle gambit lines. And, well, defending the pawn. Now f5 doesn't make a lot of sense, because now you can just go bishop f4, e3, knight c3, and that's just better for white. So normally they play knight f6 or d takes c4, and after knight f6 you can go bishop g5 or g3 with a reasonably playable position. Another move along these lines is knight bd2, but I prefer queen c2. Still, of course, e3 is very playable as well. You just gotta, deal with this stuff, which is not terrible for white. You go b3, planning to go bishop a3, queen e7. I think that's how it normally goes. Queen c1, once again going for bishop a3, and white is probably slightly better, but I tend to avoid it as well by starting with queen c2 instead of e3. What else is going on out there? Kostas Samaridis is unfortunately not a premium member, so I can't answer your question. You need this little crown or I'm not going to talk to you. It's very rough rules on Chess24. Henry23 is saying, hello Jan, are these lines sound for black? These two lines sound for black. Technically it's one question per person. Let's see. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c d4, queen b6, And e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight a5. He's trying to put together a repertoire of sidelines to avoid all these evil main lines. Yeah, they're not terrible. Like knight c6, d4 takes, and queen b6. Yeah, I think that's playable probably. Knight b3, and there's a body of theory here. Some decent players play this. I'm not very up to date here. Knight f6, knight c3, e6. I guess white can play normal, like bishop e3, bishop d3. Well, a lot of strong players like aggressive plans here with queen e2, intending to go g4, bishop d2, whatnot. And yeah, you have to be prepared for this stuff, but I would guess it's probably playable for black. The other line, bishop b5, knight a5, doesn't make a lot of sense. I've also looked into it at some point because, yeah, you don't want to allow the exchange. But to commit your knight to the edge of the board so early just can't be right. And yeah, I think black is slightly worse after, let's say, c3, a6, and either bishop e2 or bishop a4, b5, bishop c2, wherever bishop b7, castles, knight f6, rook e1, stuff like this, intending d4, or on some lines e5 and d4. I think it's a little unpleasant, and knight a5 doesn't really feel right to commit your knight to the edge of the board, but doesn't lose, and it's a playable move, but it's a worse move than e6, g6, or d6. Maybe it's the fourth best, I'm not sure. Probably queen c7. Anyway, both of these are playable, both of these not main lines, probably for a reason, but playable. Tennis Boy. Tennis Boy is also not a premium member, and even though he asks a very humorous question based on an illegal second move, I can't answer it. Hiram Liang is saying, "Hi Jan, can you give me your opinion on this e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, ed, knight d4, knight f6, knight c6, bc, queen e2. I've seen a couple games here, and it seems that black is not fully equal here. I don't know, I've never been that concerned about it, but it's certainly a playable line. And we see it coming up more and more at top level. As usual with all these lines, the reason they are coming up more and more is that people are sick and tired of the Berlin, so they're looking for alternatives. They went for the Scotch for a while, but e5 has been pretty exhausted too after queen e7. So now a bunch of guys like Nepomniachtchi and Andreikin, and I think Paco Vallejo was one of the first to play this, started playing queen e2. I don't know, I've never been concerned about it. The easiest way to play is d6 and then just bishop e7 castles, which I think should equalize. And I've recently seen Kramnik play the move bishop c5 here. Normally if Kramnik does something, we should all pay close attention. He got a better position pretty much instantly against Nepomniachtchi after g3 castles, but g3 is a mistake. The critical move here is e5, knight d5, c4, and my guess is that Kramnik wants knight to e7 here, which also looks fairly equal to me. Now you want to go castles, probably d6, and regroup this knight if you have to. White's best bet is probably bishop e3, takes, and let's say castles. Now some move knight c3 or bishop d3. Probably it's better to go bishop d3 to prepare short castles. d6, yeah, I think black is fine. If you want to go all fancy here after ed6, you don't have to recapture it, you can go knight d5 with dramatic complications. cd, rook e8, almost winning the queen. Bishop e4, cd5, which is fine for black. So white probably shouldn't take on d6, but castle or something. Well, once again, there's many equalizers. de, bishop f5, knight f5. Looks playable to me. So I don't think it's a line to be unduly concerned about, but I do think it's a line we're gonna see a lot more because, yeah, e5 has been exhausted, and there's probably still theoretical developments to come. Bishop c5 has not been the most popular move, but normally if Kramnik plays something, and this was his second attempt, I think. First time around he played queen e7, which is also playable. Knight c3, queen e6. But if he deviates and goes for bishop c5, I tend to listen, and I believe that's probably a good move. What else is happening? Speaking of Kramnik, he's playing against Topalov today. I'll go check out that game when I'm done with this show. And probably if the game was remotely interesting, I'll do a video on it. Because Kramnik, Topalov, these are highlights. Those guys really don't like each other. Oscar Schales. Sorry if I don't know how to pronounce it. Where's Oscar from? Oscar Sales from the Czech Republic. Hell Jan, thank you for this amazing stuff you do for Chess24. Thank you, Oscar. Recently, I decided to study openings deeply, and I would like to create lists of lines I should play against concrete openings and concrete moves. Also in this Q&A or Banterblitz, I'm not sure, Peter Svidler talked that he had to check his notes, and I think you stronger players have something like that. We do have that. So my question is, how should it look like? Am I supposed to create some PGN files or write it with a pen and a notebook? Nah, nowadays stuff tends to be digital, so yeah, most strong players have a PGN file with their analysis. It's not, well, in my case, well, I don't work that hard on my own openings anymore, but I do have all the analysis I've done over the years just, yeah, saved in a PGN file, and I can look them up if I don't remember something. And yeah, that's all there is to it, because you don't want to scan the database and you don't want to prepare the same line 50 times for a new opponent. You just save your analysis and then you look it up whenever you feel like. Even the stuff I'm doing here, I prepared a little PGN file and sometimes I check my notes beforehand and put it in here. So yeah, it's as simple as that. If you have a pet line, store it. Yeah, and by notes, Svidler means his file where he has his analysis saved. And yeah, I think it's a good idea to start one of those just to slightly discipline yourself to save whatever you analyze. Now on Chess24, we even have this new analysis section where you can upload PGN files and whatever. Ask people to analyze them with you, get a computer's opinion. You can do some cool stuff there. So check that out. And of course, there's also a lot of other programs out there to use PGN files with. Like this little live chess viewer here. Breaker90 is saying, "Hi Jan, I'm starting to learn how to play the Ruy Lopez as black." Now let's actually bring him up. I studied the open Lopez, but I feel I should play the traditional closed Lopez. It's strange. People say the Ruy Lopez, but I've never heard the open Lopez or the closed Lopez. I think we say the open Spanish or the closed Spanish then, but I'm not sure why. It's actually, yeah, it's strange. Anyway, back to the question. What's the best variation to play that gives chances for both sides, but it isn't too theoretical to learn? I'm looking at the Chigorin and Breyer variations right now, but if you feel there's a better variation, please inform me. Nah, I think you're on the right track. I think that's the trifecta of... There is a trifecta of main lines in the closed Spanish. Of course, I can also recommend the line with b5, bishop b3, bishop c5, where our boy Peter Svidler, we were just talking about him, did a video series for Chess24, which I'm being told is very, very good. He knows his stuff there. This is quite a dynamic line, however, it does require quite some theoretical knowledge. So yeah, I think you're right. If you want to play without that much theory, you have to be aware of d3 nowadays. It's just as popular as rook e1. But you should choose one of those. Like me, I tend to go for the Marshall, so you can check out my series on the latest trends in the Marshall as well, if you're interested in that. But once again, coming back to the closed Ruy Lopez lines, there's three main lines here. They're all playable. They're not that much to my liking because all of them lead to slow maneuvering games where you kind of have to be a good chess player, which is not my forte. But yeah, it's knight a5, knight b8, or bishop b7. All of those are playable. Bishop b7, what's called the Zaitsev d4 rook e8, is, yeah, I think just as good as the other two, but it's more theoretical. So if you don't want it to be too theoretical, I think knight b8 is a very decent choice. Then intending to go knight bd7, bishop b7, rook e8, bishop f8, and so on and so forth. It's a line played by many top players, including Magnus Carlsen and Peter Svidler, so it's certainly sound, and you could do much worse. I'm not very up to date in trends in the Chigurine, but the Chigurine knight a5 followed by c5 is also sort of a timeless line. It's always going to be around, and it's never going to go out of business. But yeah, more aesthetically pleasing, I find the Breyer or the Zaitsev with bishop b7. So yeah, that's all I got. But in general, yeah, all of these lines very playable. What else we got? Luke 71. Is that your date of birth? Year of birth? Hi Jan, what do you think is the best way to play for black in this long, very theoretical Petrov line? I can't decide what to do here. Bishop f3, knight f6. Is knight b4 any good? Does black play d takes c4 in any of those lines? Obviously not after c4. Let's bring it up on the board and see if we can help Luke. That's a very specialized question, which, yeah. Problem with the Petrov is, I think there was a game today. Ivanchuk played the Petrov against Leko. Right on top level, they all play knight c3, and these positions are a little tricky to handle. But that's because I think they exhausted most of the main lines and are a little out of fresh ideas. Here, yeah, c4 or rook e1 followed by c4 certainly are the main lines. Rook e1, bishop g4, c4. Oh, I'm sorry. I gave you the wrong position, but you gave me the right position. So let's retrace our step. You go knight c6 first, of course. Sorry. Bishop castles, bishop e7, rook to e1, bishop to g4. And here c4 with knight on c6 instead of castles. And yeah, here the best move is knight to f6. Bishop f3 is supposed to be a little dangerous. Knight f6 is what time has established as the main line. cd5 is harmless because you take, and now you take with the queen, and black is supposed to be fine. So what they do after knight f6 is the move knight to c3, and black faces a tricky choice. I'm not sure. Objectively, if you wanna spend a lot of time, if you're a Boris Gelfand, you can uphold this position, which I believe holds, but it's very, very tricky territory. cd followed by bishop b5 check or bishop f5. But objectively, this should equalize. And the slightly more practical choice is the immediate knight takes d4 here. C takes d, bishop takes f3, gf, and c5. This is the line I think Wang Yue played, which does look to lead to a playable position as well. I'm not a Petrov player, so my knowledge of details here is limited, but I've seen this Wang Yue game and it looked pretty playable for black. Hope that helped. Who knows? Oh, our friend Maximilian Meinhardt is asking a question about his favorite opening, the Tarrasch. Hi Jan, thanks for all the great and entertaining work you're doing for Chess24. Thank you, Maximilian. In How to Build Your D4 Repertoire series, you mentioned a couple of variations for white against the Tarrasch, a reasonable opening, as you call it. Did I call it a reasonable opening? I was being kind. What's your take on dc5 in the main line and the reply d4 question mark exclamation mark for black? How would you refute this gambit? Thanks and see you soon, Max. He's just preparing for our next blitz game. He knows himself that d4 is no good because he gave a question mark exclamation mark. It's one of these gambits. It's always the same with these gambits. You have to decide how much time you want to spend on them. If you want to memorize the refutation or if you think it's good enough to know they're not good and then trust yourself over the board. I normally don't trust myself over the board, so I would probably prepare it if I felt there was any chance that my opponent could do something like that. I haven't spent a lot of time researching it, I have to admit, but off the top of my head, there is this game, Friedman against Halkias. He was sitting next to me, that's why I remember it. I think Friedman got a very good position. d4, this is the line, knight a4, bishop f5, bishop f4. What do they do? Bishop e4, rook c1, queen d5. Here there's more than one line, a3 or whatnot, but Friedman just played queen b3, and that looked like a white advantage. Queen h5, what did he do? He took on b7. d3 and... I hope I didn't mix this up, but no, I think that's the position d3. I can't remember what Friedman played here. I believe rook to e1, and he got a serious advantage. In general, if you put a computer to work in these positions, I think my computer gives queen b5 or some strange move here as well. It will give significant white pluses. This gambit is not correct. It's a nice little surprise weapon, but yeah. That's all there is, as Maximilian knows himself. What else we got? Salad days. Not a premium member salad days. Get a premium membership. €9 per month, the price of a pizza or whatever. And you can ask me questions. And be begrudged by me for... Nah, I can't even think of anything clever today. Which is a problem if you're supposed to give clever answers to all these questions. So let's get to the next one. Thomas R. is saying, hi Jan, what's your opinion on the Garry Gambit? e4, c5, knight f3, e6, takes, and 8 d5. Seems to be rare nowadays, but this could also be because his anti-Taimanov isn't too common. And the Taimanov itself became again popular at top level and part of my own repertoire only quite recently. Yeah, all true. I've read all these Garry books, so I know what his opinion is. And who am I to argue? Knight b5, yeah, as you mentioned, knight b5 is not the most popular move in this position because after knight c3, a6, knight a3, black is supposed to be alright by just playing bishop e7. Check out Robin van Kampen's video series on the topic if you haven't already. He gives a very interesting idea there for black. But this gambit, which Kasparov used in the 80s in his matches against Karpov, is this d5 stuff, takes, knight to b4, which went out of fashion after Karpov came up with this idea of bishop e2. Actually, not against Kasparov, it was later against Van der Wiel. Bishop e2, bishop c5, and bishop e3. This was the big revelation, and the point was after bishop takes e3, queen a4 check. And white is much better, almost winning. However, the real problem is the move bishop c5. This was Kasparov's idea, and I think he won some model game after bishop c5 castles, but bishop e3 is a big problem. So black should probably go knight b takes d5, and I'm not sure how bad things are here. The thing is, you get a slightly worse, more or less symmetrical position where white's pieces are a little more active, so it's not really in the spirit of a gambitier here after whatever. Knight takes d5, short castles. White is a bit more active because he's already castled, and black has to be careful. Bishop f3, queen b3, rook e1, all in the air. I think the computer more or less defends here with bishop e6, bishop f3, bishop c5, but it's not something all that tempting. Actually, a computer sacrifices a pawn with short castles here. So black is fighting for equality here without being able to hope for much more. And I think that's why it went out of fashion, because the original idea is bishop c5 and playing for long-term compensation just doesn't work due to bishop e3. People aren't doing this anymore. People know stuff. Dr. Boki is saying, first of all, your commentary at the Rapid World Championship was outstanding. I had the chance to be in the auditorium. Thanks a lot, Dr. Boki. Sorry I didn't spot you in the auditorium. Now to my question. In the Catalan, after dc, bishop g2, bishop d7, knight e5, bishop c6, knight takes, castles, queen d7, e3, the line with 9 long castles is quite popular. What would you play with white? Can white avoid black's attack? Thanks and keep up the great work. I shall try. And yeah, that line, I believe I mentioned it in the introduction to my own Catalan series, because it's one of these fancy looking lines like, oh, we can castle queenside and go for a counterattack in the boring Catalan. Let's do it. The problem is, it's not very good. Or so I believe. It's certainly interesting, but I believe it doesn't quite work. So it's this line, which, yeah, you can see the appeal. Black is a pawn up at the moment, and he has this very aggressive plan of going queen d7, e3, long castles, and now you want to break in the center with e5 or go h5, h4. And yeah, I've seen some published analysis which started after knight d2, which I don't think is a good move. I believe the problem here is knight to c3, stopping e5, because now after e5, d5, or even queen a4 is just good for white. Probably queen a4 is even stronger. But anyway, e5 not a good idea. And if black goes for h5, his typical counterplay, white should just go b3, sacrifice a pawn, and white comes first with his attack. Here, c takes b, queen takes b3. If you start analyzing this position a little bit, you will notice that white's attack is faster and scarier because it's held by this super long bishop. Some lines here, bishop b4, but none of them really work. I can't remember what I wanted here. Knight to e2, maybe just bishop b2. I think white was better on all the lines. Can't remember details, but this was the problem for sure. I think knight e2. I would have to check my notes, which I haven't for this question, I have to admit, but I am fairly certain that knight c3 followed by b3 was the problem, in my opinion. Because, yeah, it's too good to be true, right? But you leave this unopposed bishop and you castle to the queen side. You really have to be sure your play is fast enough, and I don't think it works here. I would have liked to recommend it for black because it's certainly cool and dynamic, but I couldn't make it work. Unfortunately, knight c3, I believe, is a big, big problem. So yeah, that's my opinion, but I'm not really willing to change it. I'd be surprised if black could get away with this. It just feels wrong. The evil laws of chess. Bishop on the long diagonal is very strong. Superfishy 24. Oof, that's a tough question. Hi Jan, what do you think about the variation in the Taimanov arising from e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, takes, knight c6, knight c3, queen c7, bishop e3, a6, and 7, queen f3? Thanks. Oof, that's one of the most topical lines out there, isn't it? I'm not sure what I think. Frankly, I don't really have an opinion. I've barely followed it. I think it's dangerous because a lot of strong players play it with white, and they will do it with good reason. I think for a more qualified opinion than mine, you should check out Robin van Kempen's series. I'm not 100% sure what he recommends here. Queen f3. I know that Anish Giri always goes for knight e5 followed by h5, which looks crazy, but I'm not sure if it has been refuted yet. To my mind, the logical move is the move b5, when, well, white can try many different things. There were some games with long castles, bishop b7, queen g3, aiming for the endgame, which is a bit more pleasant for white, but Ivan Isavic recently came up with his bishop d6 idea, and he won a nice game against my friend David Anton from Spain by now retreating, which looks very strange, but certainly has its merit. Black is very fast with his counterplay, So this, even though it looks freaky, might be an interesting idea. Queen g7, I believe, is probably no good because of bishop e5, followed by b4. So that's the theoretical discussions I've seen. There's also knight takes c6 in this position. Queen takes c6 and bishop to d3, which also looks a little scary for black. Now, Hedgehog recently played knight f6, aiming to stop queen g3 because it runs into b4, followed by knight takes e4. So, yeah, that's what's going on at the moment here. e5, I think, was played. Takes, followed by b4. Messy stuff. Probably equalizing as well. My take, but as I said, it's not a specialist take, is the move b5 looks logical to me, and it becomes very messy. And I wouldn't be surprised, or I would be surprised if this line didn't stay popular, because the white's play is actually quite logical. Queen f3, long castles, queen g3 is useful in many lines. Very fast development. So it's a topical line. And I think it will stay topical with ideas going back and forth for a while, since it's still pretty fresh. What else we got? Hoch. Hi Jan, I have some problems against the move 1 f4. Don't we all? All these games where everybody's playing 1 f4 happened to me like at least once in my chess career that an opponent went 1 f4. Anyway, enough ridiculing. So you have problems against the move 1 knight f4. So I looked at the from Gambit to decline all the Leningrad lines a tempo down. That's one opening that's not scary when you're a tempo down. Earlier we talked about the Grunfeld, a tempo down. That's scary. Leningrad is not. How could you explain how black should proceed after f4, e5, fe, d6, ed, bishop d6, knight f3? Thanks. Yeah, black shouldn't do that because you're a pawn down. If I knew my opponents would play e5, I would start every game with 1 f4. But you can just play d5 and you're fine. Well, there's many other possible setups, but just to show one main line. Here, if they play the Leningrad, it tempo up. Here they go, queen e1, your castle. Well, the only logical move is e4. And I talked to Svidler about this. And yeah, he said he once tried this, but he didn't like his position here after takes, and e5. So he didn't go e4, but instead h3, and black was already slightly better after d4. So I believe these lines are perfectly fine, and the Leningrad, since it's more of a slow maneuvering opening, where you've already weakened your king with f4, I would play this any time of the day with a tempo down. Apart from that, there's many more lines here. You can go c6, queen b6, or do whatever you like, really. But to answer the question, f4, e5, fe, d6, ed, bishop d6. You give up both your central pawns for a measly f-pawn in the hope of checkmating with queen h4. But it doesn't work, or at least I think it doesn't. Main line goes something like this, right? g3, g4, knight h4, knight e7, bishop g2. Oh no, sorry, they don't go bishop g2. They go, what do? They go d4 here. d4, knight g6, takes. Now, once again, there's some cute threats with rook h2 or bishop g3. White parries them with queen d3, and there's not enough compensation. Knight c6, c3, parrying the next threat of knight takes d4. Yeah, I couldn't make it work for black, sorry. Queen e7, or well, sometimes they play bishop f5, but doesn't really help. e4, queen e7, bishop g2. Long castles. Looks nice and active, but white has this very strong pawn center to hide behind. So I have a hard time believing it. I could be wrong, and you could spend some more time here trying to make this work. I couldn't when I looked at it. Bishop e3, and I think white is better, or knight d2 here. However, these are the positions you want to explore. They're certainly interesting, and if you enjoy sharp play and don't mind being objectively worse, you can go for this, but objectively, yeah, I couldn't quite make it work. There was a recent game by, who was it, Schulskis. Played something like this in order not to lose a tempo after e4, but he also got into big trouble after knight d2, knight e4, threatening this. Rook h5 just takes, bishop f4. Yeah, e4 was a mistake, but if you just castle here, this position is pretty much winning for white, so I don't know. I think e5 is asking too much of a perfectly good starting position, and one should play different move like d5 or g6 or c5 or knight f6 with a fine position, because white voluntarily weakened his king and didn't help his development on the first move. And as I said, I've played quite some games with black. I think I've faced one f4 once in a tournament game. Did I? Maybe never. No, I think once, but I'm not sure. So I'd be surprised if it keeps popping up all the time. But if it did, I would not go e5, but d5 or g6 and enjoy my position. Yeah, as I mentioned, my tone gets more and more condescending the later we are into the show, but I'm also giving my honest opinion, which, yeah, what else can I do? I could lie, but I'm not planning to. Well, not all the time. K. Lamar 74 is saying, "Hi Jan, your work here on Chess24 is fantastic. Thank you so much, K. Lamar. For me, and I'm sure that for many other users as well, it feels like having a personal coach and a funny one in the same time. Thank you, thank you. Not many jokes in the opening clinic. This is my most serious program. It's just cranky opening advice. What do you think about various bishop f4 systems to meet black openings against d4, in particular against kings like Indian defense, like in Diagram, but also in Grunfeld, and so on? Playing an early bishop f4 against everything was trendy in Berlin, Rapid and Blitz. I noticed, I was commentating on that. Yeah, I think it's more of a Rapid and Blitz opening, but it looks like it's gaining a bit of popularity all over the place. And it's too general a question because there's so many iterations. If like white starts with bishop f4 here, I wouldn't go for King's Indian setups, but I would go d5 followed by c5 or c5 immediately. There was this funny Grishuk game with c5, e3, queen b6, knight c3, queen b2, knight ge2, with a mess, but my best guess is that objectively black is okay here, queen a3 or whatever. But anyway, there's many iterations of this, as I mentioned. Is that the word, iterations? Variations? But let's get to the position you posted. I'm not sure what I think about those. I'm not much of a King's Indian player. White hasn't committed a crime. I'm not sure if they go c4 and knight c3 so early. Most of the time, as I believe they start with e3, bishop e2. We've seen Carlsen do that a couple of times. Looking for fresh positions, not necessarily an opening advantage, but White's setup is more or less logical, so nothing wrong with it. I've always had a weakness for this move, knight fd7, in all of these lines, because it looks kind of cute and it makes sense. You're preparing e5 and then you want to go knight c6 with very King's Indian-esque play, hoping to provoke d5 when black would go knight e7 and have an excellent version and fighting against his bishop on h2. So I kind of like that setup. But it is certainly not the only way to play. What's going on here? Is my program letting me down? I have a feeling the program froze. Might have to restart it. Program, are you there? Nope, program is not there. I'll restart it. I'll keep sitting here and talking to you guys. But it froze. Sometimes if you guys ask too many questions, the program just gives up its work. It says, I'm only built to answer 40 questions. How do you do this? Control Alt Delete, right? Hang on, I have a new keypad here. Just give me a couple hours and we'll be back. Anyway, I'll keep talking to you about the line without the program, which I'm trying to rejuvenate. I think it's playable, and I think we're going to see more of it. Not really because it's a sharp try for an opening advantage, but in the Magnus Carlsen era and with all these openings so deeply analyzed, it does make sense for guys to look for something a little fresher. And then what happens is it stops being fresh at some point, and people do analyze it as deeply as the Grunfeld or the King's Indian main lines, and you have to look for something else. But at the moment it's still reasonably fresh, and it hasn't been analyzed by most of the top guys in detail yet. So it's not a surprise. It's used by a lot of the top players in blitz and rapid to get positions that are unknown or more unknown to their opponents, to spice it up a little bit. So I got the little board back. Here we go. And as I mentioned, yeah, there's many different versions of playing this stuff. And there's also many different plans for black to play. In this position, for example, c5 is a perfectly good move as well. But yeah, I've always had a bit of a liking for this setup. Not really sure why, it just feels harmonious to me. Bishop e2, and well, the problem with black is you have to decide what to do. You could just go aggressive f5, e4. Normally I don't like going e4 too early because it gives this bishop a future. So we've seen some games, also in this rapid, where people went b6 first and bishop b7, trying to provoke d5. And I believe they were getting pretty decent positions, Radjabov and Fressinet or whoever played like this. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on it either way. It's a playable line, and of course it heavily depends on the first one or two moves, depending where you end up. Ooh, Bluesy wrote a little essay about a move that seems very close to his heart. Hi Jan, I would like to discuss an opening not very well known, and I was wondering if it has even been considered in theoretical debate. Exchange Slav and 5f3. Bluesy is not watching this show. I'm pretty sure I've answered the same question already, or I've gotten the same suggestion in an earlier opening clinic. It's a playable line, and Bluesy gives a lot of lines. Yeah, I agree with most of it. f3 is a playable move. Let me briefly bring it up on my little chessboard. Hours later, d4, d5, c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, takes, and f3. Yeah, knight c6, e4 is pretty decent for white. I think Bluesy himself gave a line with 10 a6, which probably equalized for black. I can't remember what I replied last time, so let me change my reply. And another interesting move here, just to give you some new troubles, is the move queen to b6. Now you want to go e4, nothing else makes a lot of sense, and after e4 I will take, and go e5. And if d takes e5, knight to g4, counterattack, threatening checkmate with queen f2, and knight takes e5, very hard to parry both. So black is in good shape here, and I'm not sure what can be done about it. Bishop b5, knight c6 leads to a mess, but it also looks fine for black. And knight f3, e takes d is very sound for black as well. So there's a new refutation for you to worry about, the move queen to b6. Yeah, f3 is a tricky little move, but I think, yeah, it's a bit against the laws of chess to go f3, e4 here. Black hasn't done anything wrong. But yeah, I was surprised last time someone told me about it, that it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. But queen b6 is a very interesting move. Vux. Is that how you pronounce it? Vux? Vax? I don't know. He's saying, hi Jan, from time to time the Scotch seems to be very popular amongst Australian juniors. Who knew? Also, it seems to be easier to play the white side with respect to coming up with plans. I disagree with that. As black, I've always gone down the main line with knight f6 and later 8 bishop a6. Yep, I do the same thing. I believe this is known as the Mises variation. What tends to happen is I remember the right moves for a while, and then somewhere around move 10 to 15, find myself trying to defend a slightly worse position, which only continues to get worse. Something must be going very wrong there in these 3 moves. You might want to focus on those. Are these lines after bishop a6 theoretically sound? Yes. Is it possible to fight for a win? Yes. Are the lines after knight b6 any better? No. Any general advice facing the Scotch? I'm happy to learn some theory, but want to be fighting for a win. Well, keep doing what you're doing and try to figure out what goes wrong for you between move 8 and 12. Which, yeah, I can't really say, but the line you're giving is the absolute main line and a very sound line. It's the only line I play against the Scotch as well. So I don't quite know what causes you trouble here. There's a move queen e4, speaking of trying to play for a win when black can repeat moves, but after queen e4 it's not so easy to do something else. But you can play for a win here with knight b4 as well, which is very interesting. So what they normally do is play b3 or g3 or knight d2 here. My rule of thumb is I go g6, bishop g7 against everything, unless his knight is attacked. And then I start thinking, and as far as I know, the main lines are all fine for black, so I'm not quite sure what's giving you trouble. And I do disagree that this position is easier to play with white than with black. I think it's much harder to play with white, because you need to consolidate your messy position and get your pieces out. Well, with black, this plan, for example, g6, is quite easy to play. Some theory here, actually a lot of theory, but if you don't mind learning some. Main move nowadays is f4 here. d6 is fine. This is a mess, but it's fine. The old main line used to be something like g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, bishop g2, bishop b2 castles, sorry, bishop g2, rook a8, which is also very, very fine for black. Castles, bishop takes e5, and, well, this is just a forced line. Oh, one of the forced lines. It's not forcing lines, I should say. It's not forced. Now this leads to an endgame where I believe only black can be better, even though white has decent chances to hold. But, yeah. Well, it's a huge field, and you have to know some theory and understand some subtleties. But if you stick with this plan, you want to go g6, bishop g7, normally short castles, and rook to e8, unless something extraordinary happens, you're going to be in pretty decent shape. There's other lines here. Knight d2 is sometimes tried with the idea of knight f3. But once again, bishop g7, g6, bishop g7 tends to do well. So I'm sorry, I don't know what happened in your games against the other Australian juniors there, but I would not blame the line with bishop a6. That's fine. So is knight b6. It's also playable. But I think bishop a6 is a perfectly good move. Satirica is asking, Hi Jan, what's your opinion on the h6, d6, g6 Fianchetto line in the Italian game? e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3, h6. Are there any major drawbacks for black? Thank you. No, I don't think there's major drawbacks. I play it once in a while myself. Well, one major drawback is that knight f6 allows knight g5, but if you're prepared for that, and after d3, yeah, h6 looks a little funny. I mainly try when I want to keep pieces on the board. Objectively, bishop c5 is fine, of course, but to spice things a little up a little bit, nothing really wrong with going for this setup with h6, d6, g6. Black is probably slightly worse. That's the price of avoiding simplifications. Here after d4 you gotta go queen e7, and such a position tends to be slightly better for white, but nothing too serious. And black has an abundance of plans here, knight h5, knight h7, king h7, followed by knight h5. So I think it leads to a playable position, and it's a decent way to try to play for a win. If I want to equalize, I would normally go bishop c5 here or move earlier, but I'm not aware of any grave problems with the h6, g6 setup. Of course, you have to start with h6 because g6, knight g5 is trouble. No, I think that's a playable line. GB2284. Hi Jan, I'm trying to take up the Taimanov Sicilian versus 1e4 as per GM Van Kampen's video series. It's an excellent video series, good choice. One thing he doesn't cover in that series is how to play against 2 knight c3. What structure would you suggest, for example, against the Grand Prix attack and the King's Indian attack? Many thanks. P.S. When is part 2 of your series against 1d4 coming out? I don't know. Couple of weeks would be my best guess. I'm working on it, but it's gonna take a little bit. To answer the question, yeah, it would kind of break the format of this show to give you a repertoire against the close Sicilian, but I can give some brief opinions. Knight c3, yeah, your second move here depends on what line you want to play. If you want to play the Najdorf, you should probably go for a6 or d6. But if you want to play the Taimanov, you can go knight c6. And yeah, this f4 line, I believe both g6 and e6 are sound here. e6, you have to know a little more stuff. This is the line Avur was recommending, which looked playable to me. But you can also go for g6, bishop g7. And this stuff, yeah, here I would just play g6. And play this position where the structure depends very much on white's next move. After f4 I would probably go e6. Well, after bishop e3 I would either go e5 and knight g7, or for some rook b8 followed by b5. Generally I believe all these lines are supposed to be fine for black. Of course they're fine for white too, but they just lead to a playable position where you don't have to know that much theory. So no, the close Sicilian is not that scary. You just gotta be careful they don't move order you out of your repertoire. A lot of people try that. They go knight f3 here, and all of a sudden, as a Najdorf player, it's very hard to get back into it. But as a calm player, you can go knight c6, and nothing too bad should happen to you. What else we got? Alberto Muniz is asking about d4, d5, c4, bishop f5 for a level around 2100. I think that's a terrible line for any level. I believe in it with the order d4, d5, knight f3, bishop f5. Yeah, there it's less terrible. But with 2c4, how bad is the endgame? d4, d5, c4, bishop f5. Let's put it on the board. Is it as bad as the recent Kayakin Svidler? Bishop pair and semi-endgame for not too much. I don't... Yeah, Svidler made a mistake. That wasn't because of the line he chose, even though the line he chose was a little suspect as well. But yeah, don't do that. That's the short answer. Just, yeah, abandon the idea. Play something else. If you want a goofy move here, think about knight c6. But do not play this. Here, I don't know. Just look at the position. You're giving up a bishop and the center for really not much. Rook takes b1 is better for white. Queen a4, c6. Yeah, the line you mentioned with dc6 is better for white. But also the very simple. I would just go rook b1, queen d5, and whatever, knight f3 is a serious advantage for white. Because white has the two bishops, didn't pay a price for it, and he has the pawn majority in the center. Knight f3, they normally go here and here. I'm not sure about b4. Any move will do here. e3 is also good, but b4 is fine. And white just has a very serious positional advantage, so I do not think that this line is playable. Don't do it. Or play it against me at the very least, but in general, don't play it. It's not good. And it's not the sexy not good where wherever you get like some traps and compensation and messy and white is to navigate the jungle. Here you're just positionally worse for not much. I'm not sure about the move b4, but just the position itself. It's not playable. It's just not. Flow Power. Flow Power is a big fan of the Marine books, and he loves asking questions about that complex. c4, c6, knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2. How has theory developed? I don't know. I don't follow that stuff all that much. Because, yeah, I would never do that with white, since it's not logical to me to fianchetto your bishop against this wall of pawns. Like, if they go c4, c6, why would you want to put your bishop to g2 here? I know that's a simplistic worldview and things are complicated, but yeah, I'm not planning to add it to my wide repertoire. Anyway, how theory developed? I don't know. I think in these lines, white is sort of doing alright here after queen c2. Did it go queen c2? Oh no, sorry, they start with 95. 95, bishop e6, queen c2. Black is a little scared to go queen d4 because of this knight c6 stuff. So instead they go g6 when, well, now white has a nominal advantage. Of course it's playable for black, but white might be slightly better, so that's fine. The move b5, which, yeah, I played, and it's an idea of Paco Vallejo. Was played by Viciana a couple times. Seems like he's doing alright here. a4, bishop b7. A recent game with d3 and b4. The big point is that after b3, black plays b4 and gets good position. But Alan also played against d3. I haven't checked that yet, but that's certainly interesting. So yeah, that one would have to check. And the solid line played by Magnus Carlsen, for example, is bishop g4, 95, bishop e6. Also seems to be doing fine. That's the extent of my knowledge. As I mentioned, I don't really believe this line can be that great because it's just illogical to fianchetto the bishop against that guy, but that might be too simplistic a worldview on my part. What else we got? Player 69, not a premium member. Clash. Hi Jan, what's your opinion about two strange pawn moves? e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, and now 3 e5 and d4, knight f6, g4. Both nonsense, with the former being less nonsensical than the latter. e5, yeah, I must admit I had never seen this or heard of this until I read your question a bit earlier today. Normally these things, they are not as bad as they look, which is the appeal, but it's very hard to believe that black can waste a second tempo and create this tension in the center. I've done some very, very brief clicking around, and after d e5 it looked to me like white is just better. The line my computer was spitting out something like this, and it looks like black ends up in a slightly worse endgame, which often happens. You play some cute looking idea leading to complications, but if white reacts, oh no, sorry, don't take on e5, even though this is also slightly better, but just go here, takes, and you get a symmetrical position, couple tempi down where you have to move your bishop again. Then I would target the c7 pawn, and black is in some trouble here. So yeah, I don't think it can work, but I have to admit I haven't spent much time on it. It's just not a logical move. That's what... Nah, I shouldn't become too Dr. Tarrasch style. It's not logical or whatnot. Whatever works, works. I don't think this one works. And the other line, yeah, I don't think that's even pretending that it wants to work. d4, knight f6, g4. Yeah, it's just nonsense. A lot of g4s nowadays, but this is not one of them. You just take it after e4, d5. Well, d6 is fine too, of course. But d5, and black is already seriously better, so not much more I can tell you about it. e5, c5. Black has a very serious opening advantage, which you don't often get, but if they give you a clean pawn on move number 2, there's a chance. That's my opinion. What time is it? 2 hours in. More questions by player 69 or more comments. Shacho. What's Shacho up to? Moin Jan, thanks for all the excellent tips. Many opening repertoires with black against d4 are based on a bishop development to b4. Niklas, as an example, goes for the Nimzo against knight c3 and a Bogo Indian against knight f3. d4, knight f6, c4, e6. But what if white plays the weird-looking 3a3? How do you develop against that if your repertoire is based on the bishop b4 move? Come on, Schacho. You're a better player than that. Normally your repertoire is based on the idea of either equalizing or unbalancing the position and not on a single move. a3 just loses a tempo. That's why people don't do it. They go knight c3 or knight f3 when you can get your bishop out. After a3, yeah, you have a pleasant choice between d5, which is a queen's gambit where white played a3, or c5, which is, yeah, whatever it can lead to, a Benoni or some knight f3 line where white also played a3, which is not very useful. Of course, white is not worse. He's white, and a3 makes some sense in some lines, but what do you want me to tell you? You cannot put your bishop on b4. That is correct, but white paid a heavy price by losing a tempo to stop that. I mean, in some iterations this makes sense, of course. Knight f3, b6, and a3 is a main line of the Queen's Indian. Now that black is committed to b6, bishop b7, white can lose his tempo to establish his knight on c3. But if white would go here immediately, yeah, either d5 or c5 solves all of black's problems. And yeah, now it's white to move, so how to develop the pieces heavily depends on white's reply. No, knight c3, you can already go c5, or you can go dc4. All of these all of a sudden are good since white played a3, or bishop e7 is of course also possible. And yeah, a3, c5, similar story. After d5, you develop your pieces differently. Let's say takes, b5. Okay, this is already a little freaky stuff. But has anybody ever done this? Where does this question come from, Schacho? Did someone play a3 against you and you didn't know what to do because your bishop couldn't get out? It's not a big problem. I think we're through. There's another question by player 69, but he's not a premium member, and this show is only designed to answer questions of premium members so they can get my opening insight and my I'm looking for the right word. It's not advice. It's also not contempt. It's, yeah, I don't know, my opinions on stuff. So if you aren't one already, become a premium member. You can also watch all the great video series on Chess24. Enjoy the added features for premium members, faster engine analysis, opening database, opening tree analysis, blah, blah, blah. You can play against many grandmasters in Banter Blitz. You can ask me questions. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. Thanks for watching this show, everybody. If you've posted your questions after the show began, I'm sorry, I have to wrap it up now. We're 2 hours in, and I did not prepare for the questions that were posted after show start. So next time, look for the announcement. Post your questions then. Thanks a lot for your patience. Sorry for me always being in a terrible mood when I do this. I don't know why. Something about the opening clinic brings out the worst in me. But I hope we still all learn something. That's why I like doing it, because I get to look at these lines and I learn something. Believe it or not, I don't know everything off the top of my head, but I like finding out stuff. Thanks a lot for watching. See you guys next time. Until then, bye-bye.